Hi everyone. First off, I want to thank you all for your support. Sometimes I don't get a chance to get to everyone's comments straight away, and I'm sorry for that, but I do read them all eventually. As well as that, may I ask those of you who enjoy the channel and are not subscribed to please do so, and together we'll try and get the numbers up this year. So that's it really. On with the case. Today our case brings us to Ballymena in County Antrim in Northern Ireland. Ballymena was founded in 1626 and it lies in the River Main Valley, 24 miles northwest of the city of Belfast. It is the seventh largest town in County Antrim by population and it is a mainly Protestant area. It perches on the coastal route that leads to the Giant Causeway, and inland there are forests, rivers and unspoiled countryside surrounding the town. Here lived a family, the Tennants. Billy and Eilish Tennant were parents to 6 daughters, and one of these daughters was 21-year-old Julie. The Tennant family home had been a happy one. Julie was described as a bright and bubbly girl who had the whole world at her feet. She was particularly close to her youngest sister Caroline, who was just 7 years old when she was murdered. Julie's parents said she was a quiet girl who never bore any grudges against anyone. They did admit that she had problems with heroin, but was doing her best to sort herself out. Julie had left their home on the 5th of August 2000 from Mount Street in Ballymena, and by the 9th of August her parents reported her missing to the RUC, which is the Royal Ulster Constabulary, the police force in Northern Ireland at that time. It would later become known as the Police Service of Northern Ireland, or the PSNI, which would come into effect on the 4th of November 2001. Julie hadn't been seen for 4 days. She was carrying very little cash and was classed as vulnerable, as she had left her medication at home, and she had just been released from a drug rehab facility in Antrim. Even though Julie had her problems, it was unusual for her friends or family not to hear from her. Her family had spent the previous 4 days looking for her, going to her usual spots around Ballymena and asking her friends if they had seen her. But when the family came up empty, it was then they had no option left but to report her missing. The police straight away appealed to the public for their help. It was reported that Julie was last seen at her home on Saturday the 5th of August 2000 at around lunchtime. Julie was suffering from depression and didn't have her medication. She had not been the only young woman to go missing around this time, and this added to the concern. Maria McConnell from Belfast, also classed as vulnerable, disappeared in July of that same year, and she was found 12 days later, and a man was eventually arrested and charged with her murder after confessing. But at this time, even though the two cases were not connected, it worried the police that they could have a similar case on their hands. As a result of this appeal, a man came forward to tell the police that he was out with a group of friends on that Saturday night. While they were getting food at a Chinese takeaway, Julie, who they knew, approached them, asking one of them if they could get a syringe for her. As she stood outside with a group of people, another man came out of the Chinese takeaway and told her he could get her one, but that it was back at his flat. This man was Adrien Hayes. Adrien Hayes was born in Ballymena in County Antrim in 1973 and was raised in a village called Bruckshane, which is 3.5 miles outside Ballymena town. Growing up, he had been bullied as a young child, and this led him to rebel in his early teens. It wasn't long before he was locally known as the Hard Man because of his love for getting into fights. When he left school, this would escalate into more serious fights, which would get the attention of the local police. He would also begin to steal, and at the age of 18, he would have his first experience of being incarcerated. He was put into a young offenders institution. His first sentence was 3 years, but he would only serve 31 days, as he had appealed his sentence and it was granted. When he left prison and at the age of 19, he moved to Amsterdam and got himself involved in drugs there. When he returned to Bruckshane, he would begin to deal drugs there. Over the next few years, he would build himself up a spreadsheet of criminal convictions, including drug dealing, assault and robbery. In 1999, he met his wife Fiona, and they got married in 2000. This was not a happy union. Hayes drank a lot, and when he was drunk, he would take his frustrations out on Fiona, many times ending up in hospital because of the beatings. After one such occasion, Fiona would discover she was pregnant. It was after this discovery Fiona left Hayes. 4 months later, Julie would go missing. After the witness came forward and named Hayes being there that Saturday night Julie went missing, 26-year-old Hayes was quickly picked up by police and brought in for questioning. When they brought him in and asked him about that night, he claimed that he left Julie at the Chinese with the other men and had gone home alone. He was released without charge. But when police questioned Hayes' neighbours about that night, they told him that they had heard a woman crying and it was coming from his flat. Based on this information, the officers decided to search Hayes' flat. In the hallway, they found blood spatters on the walls. They immediately sealed off the flat and forensics were called. The RUC released a statement that it was their belief that Julie had been in the flat. When Hayes got word that his flat was being searched, he fled to England. Now, not only were they searching for Julie, but they now had to go find Hayes also. Hayes had an uncle living near Kent in England, and so this is where he ended up. The uncle contacted the police telling them that Hayes had turned up at his house and had been staying with him. He told the police that Hayes had admitted to him that he had killed Julie and buried her body in a shallow grave near Brockshane in County Antrim. The uncle tried to persuade Hayes to turn himself in to police in Kent, but he refused and said he would return to Antrim and turn himself in there. The uncle didn't trust him to do this, so he took note of his registration, and it was then the uncle made the phone call to the police. Following a short car chase, Hayes was taken into custody and returned to Northern Ireland and handed over to police in Antrim. When detectives interviewed Hayes, he denied having anything to do with Julie going missing. The detectives told him that they had identified Julie's blood in the flat, and neighbours had heard crying and screaming coming from his flat on the Sunday morning of the 6th of August at around 2 a.m. Still, Hayes denied everything. By now the search for Julie had turned to the village of Brockshane, on the information Hayes' uncle had given to police. A team of 12 officers began combing the fields, laneways and ditches of the village. A helicopter was included in the search to see if they could identify any land that had been recently disturbed. On the 24th of August, Hayes was interviewed for a second time, and it was then he admitted to attacking Julie. But he never intended to kill her, he said. He told police that he tricked Julie into going back to his flat under the pretense that he had a clean needle. He said that he was lonely after he had split up with his wife and that he wanted someone to talk to. But when Julie realised that Hayes lied to her and didn't actually have a needle, she became angry and they began to argue. He said during the argument he became enraged and began punching Julie with his fists, a prolonged attack of around 20 minutes. He also told police that she was conscious during the assault and Julie was moaning and crying the whole time. He said, quote, "She started to do my head in, so I superglued her lips together to quieten her down." Of course he expressed to police how very sorry he was for what he had done and sorry for taking Julie away from her family. This information shocked the police, and at this stage they went all in on Hayes to get him to tell them where Julie was buried, which he did eventually. When he did tell them, they asked him to show them where exactly she was buried, and he agreed. They led him to a squad car, loaded him in and drove him to the outskirts of Brockshane. There, at the edge of a tree-lined winding road, they would find Julie buried in a shallow grave. The body was wrapped in a white bedsheet and black plastic sheeting, which was secured with duct tape. The area was sealed off immediately and a forensic team were brought in to examine the body and the area. Hayes was brought back to the RUC station and charged with murder. When forensics were finished with the body, it was removed for a full postmortem by Deputy State Pathologist Dr. Alistair Bentley. He began by removing the black plastic and bedsheet. Julie was naked from the waist down. Her underwear was cut in two and placed across her chest. There were other items of clothes also found on her upper body. Her legs were tied with a red electrical cable. Strips of fabric that had been knotted together were also found around her upper body and around her neck. A green plastic bag had also been tied around her neck by the handles, along with a rope around her wrists, waist and ankles. Superglue was also observed around her mouth and hair, along with bruising on her face and head. A C-shaped fracture was found on her right temple and her body was bruised all over. The toxicology report showed there was alcohol and traces of drugs found in her system, but the levels were low and did not contribute to her death. He said she would have died within minutes. Because Julie had lay in the shallow grave for more than 2 weeks, her remains were very decomposed, and so Dr. Bentley could not determine the actual cause of death. However, he concluded that it was probable that Julie's airways had been restricted due to her lips being superglued, along with seepage of blood from her nasal passage from her shattered nose. In other words, she had suffocated. The Tennant family were devastated over her death. Along with her 5 sisters, they could not comprehend that she was dead, but also that she had died in such a horrific way. 3 weeks after Julie was killed, she was laid to rest. She was brought from her home in Cannon Street in Ballymena, where she was waked, to All Saints Church. A guard of honour was held by the students from the school Julie once attended, as she was brought from the church to the nearby cemetery. When the trial of Adrien Hayes opened on January the 28th, 2000, at the Crown Court in Coleraine in County Derry, he pleaded not guilty to murder but admitted to manslaughter, which was rejected by the Crown. The Crown opened by saying Julie was violently assaulted by Hayes at his flat in Ballymena in the early hours of August the 6th, 2000. He said that Hayes lured Julie to his flat under the false pretence of having a needle, just 6 hours after she had left the drug rehab facility. He said that Julie had tried to leave the flat when he hadn't the needle he had promised, that he had followed her into the hallway and punched her as she tried to leave, and when she fell to the ground he beat her with both fists. A vicious and prolonged attack that lasted 20 minutes, according to Hayes. Many of the friends and family of Julie left the court in tears, as it was described how Hayes admitted to pouring superglue into Julie's mouth and clamping it shut, so he wouldn't have to listen to her groaning in pain. Hayes said after doing this he lay on the couch and fell asleep. When he awoke, Julie was dead. On finding her dead, he removed the lower part of her clothing, wrapped her body in bed sheets and bin liners, and left her in a shed in the back garden, before going on an overnight trip with his estranged wife. When he returned from this trip, Hayes disposed of Julie by burying her in a shallow grave in an isolated area just outside the village of Brookshane. The neighbours to Hayes took to the stand and described what they heard that morning. They described how they had been awoken by the sound of a woman crying and wailing, and it was coming from Hayes's flat. They also heard the sound of someone going up and down the stairs at around 2 a.m. When they got up from their bed to investigate, they saw lights on in Hayes's flat and the shed, but couldn't see who or what was going on. They then went downstairs as the noise was ongoing and getting louder, and so they began banging on the wall shared by both flats. As they did so, they heard the front door opening, and they got scared, so they thought whoever was next door was coming for them, and so they went back upstairs to their bedroom. But they did come back downstairs when nothing happened. It was then they heard a scratching noise, which sounded like a carpet or rug was being cleaned with a wire brush. The couple went back upstairs to bed, but could still hear the crying, but more muted this time. The following day, Hayes' interview tapes with the police were played to the jury. As they were playing, Hayes sat in the dock weeping. The first one heard was Hayes denying he had anything to do with Julie's death. He said that he had returned home to his flat alone and had eaten his Chinese before ringing his estranged wife and going to bed. During the second interview, Hayes is heard confessing to the detectives, telling them, quote, "I went blank and saw red," after an argument about drug use. Julie got up to leave and he followed her into the hallway and punched her in the face. Julie had fallen and hit her head on the stairs and proceeded to shout insults at him. It was then Hayes lost control and started hitting her over and over with both fists. He said she moaned in agony as she lay on the ground, and this is when he decided to glue her lips together, as listening to her started to do his head in. After beating her, he went in and watched a bit of television and fell asleep. When he woke 20 minutes later, the flat was in silence. Julie was no longer making any noise. He said he went into the hallway where Julie was lying. He reached down, felt for a pulse, but there was none. He said he panicked and didn't know what to do, so he wrapped her in a sheet and black plastic bags to catch the blood that was pouring from her body. He tied her with rope, burnt her handbag and trainers, and put her in the shed in the garden. 2 days later, he moved her to the outskirts of Brockshane and buried her in a shallow grave. He also stated that poor Julie was conscious when he superglued her lips together and believed she knew what he was doing, but didn't resist as he did it. He denied wanting to have sex with Julie, that he just wanted to have someone to talk to, and that by supergluing her lips together, he didn't realise that in doing so, it would lead to her death. He just wanted her to be quiet. Hayes also took to the stand to give evidence, and proceedings had to be continuously halted because he kept breaking down. He said he had been drinking heavily due to the depression, and that he was finishing up a night out with friends when he met Julie at the Chinese takeaway. He admitted that he claimed that initially he thought she had gone with the other men that were with him that night and had made his way home alone. Only Julie had followed him. This statement was proven false by the men that were there, who said Hayes and Julie had left together. Hayes said on the stand that he and Julie went into his flat together that morning. They began to argue and Julie went to leave. As she made her way into the hallway, Hayes followed her. He alleged he thought she was going to hit him, and so he punched her in the face before she got a chance to hit him. Hayes said that Julie got back up and began hitting him, so he punched her again. This time she fell and hit her head on the stairs. He said he tried to lift Julie back up, but she began hitting him again, and it was then he lost control and began punching her for a whole 20 minutes. When he finished beating her, he fetched the superglue from the other room, as her moans were getting to him. When Hayes found Julie dead, he was torn between confessing and taking his own life. But instead he phoned his pregnant estranged wife and confessed his love for her on the answering machine. Obviously, this confession of love worked as they left for a romantic night away together, while poor Julie's body lay in Hayes's shed in the garden. Hayes said he wanted to confess to his estranged wife, but he couldn't bring himself to. He also said he wanted to crash the car into a wall, but couldn't bring himself to kill his estranged wife and their unborn child. When he returned from his trip, he took Julie out of the shed, drove her to Brockshane and cried as he was burying her. Hayes said he lied in his first interview through shock, fear and panic. He was asked how he could bring himself to go on a romantic breakaway just hours after he took Julie's life, giving his state of mind of alleged shock. He said he never intended to harm Julie, he just wanted her to leave his flat following drug use. However, this was not true, as the toxicology report showed that Julie had no drugs in her, only what was prescribed, and she had only a small amount of alcohol in her also. Hayes said over the coming weeks after Julie's murder, he wanted to tell the truth, but his mind wouldn't let him, and he was in denial of what had happened. The Crown would say differently. The reality was he didn't want to get caught. It took just an hour for the jury to come to a decision. Hayes was found guilty of the murder of Julie. It was a unanimous verdict and Hayes stood motionless as the verdict was read out, while his estranged wife wept openly. The Tennant family said they were glad to have justice for Julie and they hoped they could now turn the page to this dark chapter in their lives. Eilish, Julie's mother, said, quote, "No sentence can bring Julie back to us, but we have seen justice done today. Julie will live on through us and we will live for Julie. She was a dear, dear daughter and we miss her beyond words." They also thanked the police and witnesses who helped bring Julie's killer to justice. But the justice the Tennant family got was not what they expected. The following month, Hayes was given a life sentence with a minimum term of 17 years in prison, with time served. Although Hayes showed no remorse, the judge was not satisfied that the killing was premeditated. The Tennant family were not happy. Life should mean life, and at this rate he could be out in 15 years, they said. Their youngest child will be 21 when he gets out. the same age Julie was when she was murdered. The Tennant family were also critical of the fact that Hayes was not in prison before the murder. He had been up in court on a number of charges before he killed Julie, one being charged with carrying a concealed weapon. He received several suspended sentences, and when he killed Julie, he was on probation. A woman named Laura also came forward to say she had a sinister encounter with Hayes months before Julie's murder. Hayes had taken a shine to Laura, who worked as a waitress in a pub he frequented in Brockshane. He began stalking her after she knocked him back after a series of advances, and he did not take kindly to her polite rejection. She would go on to say, quote, "He never seemed to blink as he watched me work." After a time, work colleagues said to her that he never was in the pub, only when she was working. Hayes would watch her every move, smiling, trying to flirt or make eye contact with her, sending her flowers with a note, asking her if she'd like to go out on a date with him. But Laura's instincts were kicking in, and she knew there was something not good about him. He made her feel uneasy. Laura declined his offer of a date, but Hayes continued to frequent the pub, watching her every move. One weekend, though, Laura was attending a house party with her friends and Hayes was there. After the party, they needed a lift home, and so Hayes volunteered his mother, saying she worked as a taxi driver on the side. They went back to his parents' home with him, but when they arrived, Hayes started removing his clothes and screaming at his mother to get out of her bed. Laura and her friends made a quick getaway out of the house before things got worse. A couple of hours later, Hayes turned up on Laura's doorstep, and Laura, not thinking, offered him a lift home, just wanting to get rid of him as fast as possible. But she regretted this offer instantly, as Hayes seemed particularly aggressive. They drove for about 200 metres when, without warning, he pulled on the handbrake, bringing the car to a sudden stop. Laura fled from the car to a neighbour's house, with Hayes in tow screaming abuse at her. Then Hayes turned back towards Laura's house, threatening to cut the throat of her newborn foal, who was grazing in a paddock nearby with its mother. Laura, now also heading back to her house with this threat, checked that the horses were unharmed and they were fine. She then went to her back door, and on the door was a note in Hayes's blood stating, quote, "I will kill you." Police were called straight away, and after a struggle, Hayes was arrested. Officers advised Laura to move from her home, as they were well aware that Hayes did not make idle threats. For weeks after, the police escorted Laura to her premises to feed and care for her animals. Given Laura's connection to the Hayes family and her fear of repercussions from him if she pressed charges, the matter never went to court. Laura left her job as a waitress and stayed close to home. Little did she know, a few months later she would realise what a lucky escape she had had when she found out about Julie's murder and how close she was to it being her that could have been murdered. Hayes was to serve his sentence in HMP Magbury, which is a high security prison near Lisburn in Northern Ireland, but he was never far from controversy. His prison number was 666, and he would boast that he was the devil's disciple, but this would not last long, as soon he went to the other side and claimed he had found God. In May 2008, Hayes was picked to appear in a BBC documentary about prison life. During the interview, he eagerly portrayed himself as a born-again Christian. The Tennant family were not impressed at seeing his face on television and complained to the prison service for allowing Hayes to be featured on the show. They saw that the prison service and the BBC had given him a platform to show that he was reformed and to minimise what he had done to Julie. In 2009, Hayes launched a High Court challenge against his Christian status and the right to worship within prison. This came about as he was denied private ecclesiastical visits in the prison chapel. He also wanted to change his religion from Presbyterian to Pentecostal. It was perceived by the prison that Hayes was viewing religion as an a la carte approach to religion within the walls of the prison. Hayes won this case. This infuriated the Tennant family further, branding it as another attention-seeking scam by Hayes. In 2011, Hayes became romantically involved with a fellow Christian who was visiting the prison through the ministry she was involved in, who visited the prison to preach. This romance lasted until 2016 when they became engaged, but the woman ended the relationship after the local newspaper got wind of the romance. By this time, it was drawing close to Hayes' minimum term of 17 years being up. He was granted day release privileges, which is part of the plan of reintegration into society. However, his day release was soon revoked as he was caught trying to bring cannabis into the prison. Hayes claimed he did it under duress, as a local gang had threatened to harm his family if he didn't do what he was told. He was ultimately charged, but the case had to be dropped as the prison service failed to produce CCTV footage to corroborate the case. Something fishy here. In 2018, Hayes was transferred to an open prison where he could come and go as he pleased, and then he was fully released on licence. But it wouldn't be long before he landed himself back in prison. It was discovered that he had been on Tinder looking for female company. He was also writing his number on cards that were handed out to churchgoers. This was also in breach of his strict early release terms. He was also under the conditions to inform any woman of his previous conviction before going into any type of relationship with them. In October 2022, Hayes was once again returned to the open prison and was eventually released again. Since his release, he has been spotted out and about in Belfast. Meanwhile, the Tennant family carry on their lives without Julie. Julie's mother said, quote, "He has never apologised for Julie's murder. We just live day to day. Rest in peace, Julie."